Everybody. We are excited for today's webinar and today's learning experience, understanding high quality work-based learning and policy considerations. We're delighted you're here. I'm Virgil Hammonds, the CEO at the Aurora Institute. And the Aurora Institute and its Center for Policy and Research and Competency Works Initiative is dedicated to providing information about K-12 competency-based education, including the transference of knowledge and information about competency-based ed, building knowledge on challenging policy and implementation considerations, while also providing research and evaluation on competency-based education. Before we dive in, though, let's pause for a moment of acknowledgement. The Aurora Institute and Competency Works acknowledge that this virtual webinar takes place on lands that have been home to Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. We acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our regions, Turtle Island and beyond. By focusing on the whole child, real-world application, and learning in context, competency-based education uses similar principles to traditional Indigenous education. Whether intentional or not in the initial design, we acknowledge that CBE ideas reflect traditional Indigenous education approaches that long predate CBE. We want to take a moment to honor the ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that Indigenous people have shown worldwide. Specifically, we reflect on the impact of colonization on Indigenous peoples through education systems and the profound brutalization faced as their traditional knowledge systems and ways of being were marginalized and suppressed. I am currently tuning in from my home in Farmingdale, Maine, which is on the traditional unceded territory of the Wabanaki. I'm excited to introduce to have our panel introduce themselves. So I will turn it currently to Lori.
Hi, I'm Lori Gagno. I'm the Program Director of Competency Works at the Aurora Institute, tuning in from Somerville, Massachusetts, the traditional territory of the Massachusetts, Pawtucket, and Nampeg.
And hi, all. I'm Charlotte Cahill. I'm Associate Vice President for Education at Jobs for the Future. I lead our national education to career pathways work. And I will turn this over to Maud.
Hello, everybody. I'm Maud Dodon. I'm the Executive Leader of Career Connect Washington out here in Washington State. And I am on the ancestral lands of the Methow tribe in Okanagan County, Washington at the moment. So appreciate their stewardship of this place.
Hi, and I'm Carrie Ballast, here in Texas, representing Texas Workforce Commission. I'm part of a division called Workforce Development, and I oversee our workforce education programs.
Thank you, team. Excited to partner with you and join you in sharing a bit about your work and impact of it. Let's kickstart first by some of you already started to do this. If you don't mind, as we introduced ourselves in chat, please introduce who you are, your role, the organization you serve alongside, and in consideration of the topic for today, your first job or internship. Give you a few seconds to do that. And as folks are doing that, our agenda on the left, you can see, whoops, if you don't mind going back just one, Kiara, sorry about that. Our agenda for today is to share what we are learning about work-based learning experiences and competency-based ed, a focus on what are the components of high-quality work-based learning, and as you've heard from our team here, providing some state examples, specifically from Texas and Washington. We will also share some state and federal policy recommendations and also provide the opportunity for you to ask any questions. And as usual with the webinar, we will share all resources and the link to the recording after the webinar. Thank you again for including your introduction in chat. It's wonderful to see all of you here. With that, I believe I'm turning to Lori to kickstart.
Thanks, Virgil. Glad to be starting us off. So we all know the importance of learning experiences that are happening beyond the walls of traditional classrooms. But how might federal policy support such experiences to prepare our young people for life beyond high school? And Aurora's recent report on work-based learning, pictured here, aims to help answer that question. And while momentum is growing to design and implement pre-K through 12 up to 12 through workforce pathways to support work-based learning, there's still a lot of work to be done in creating truly aligned and supportive policy environments across local, state, and federal levels. And so that's what we're going to be exploring today. And as we dig into that, I want to start us off by, if we can go to the next slide, framing a little bit about how high quality work-based learning integrates into the bigger picture of an education system that supports every learner to thrive and be ready for their future. Competency-based education, as we envision it, is a coherent learning system designed around learning rather than time spent in a classroom. The definition of competency-based education, written with lots of field input, incorporates the research from the learning sciences, and it identifies the culture, structures, and pedagogical practices that are needed for students and their learning to be at the center by design. This new graphic representation that you can see here of the definition shows how we create those experiences to enable students to learn the knowledge, skills, and dispositions they need to navigate our dynamic world, where it's equally important to learn how to learn, to have durable, transferable skills, as it is to also know the specific technical skills and academic knowledge. And we're seeing this at new levels, both in the workplace and in school, with the emergence of things like generative AI. So within a competency-based framework, work-based learning is a great example of personalized pathways where students are learning actively using different pathways and varied pacing. And when we're clear on the learning goals and the learning system is effectively capturing the evidence of learning rather than the time spent in the classroom, it opens up where we can learn, including in the workplace. And work-based learning also supports student agency because students are making decisions about their goals and how to pursue them. And I just want to elevate the equity element of the definition in that we need to really ensure that all students have access and the support to be successful in high-quality work-based learning opportunities. So within the context of CBE, work-based learning is a wonderful entry point into building a system, or it can also be a natural extension of a school redesign process. And each of these elements can be worthy of their own focus and investment. And we believe that in a coherent CBE system, these practices are actually greater than the sum of their parts. So when when pursued in a thoughtful and inclusive way, they can help us transform systems to attain and sustain rigorous and equitable outcomes for every student. So with lots of excitement around work-based learning and career pathways, we can move to the next slide. There's opportunity to connect to increasing momentum around competency-based education as well. And this map shows the shift over the past decade or so that is showing how states are recognizing competency rather than just using seat time to produce credits or make promotion decisions. Going forward, we have an opportunity to blend and braid both the funding, but also programmatic ideas that engage students and produce educational opportunities that prepare students and help them to discover the unique gifts, talents, and interests that each of us possesses as people. I'm going to turn it over now. We're excited to partner with Jobs for the Future on today's webinar, and Charlotte Cahill, Associate Vice President at JFF, is going to talk about high quality work-based learning.
Thanks, Lori. Hi, everyone. So yeah, wanted to just, take a minute today to give you all a little bit of an overview of how we at JFF think about what high quality work-based learning looks like. If I could, next slide, please. For those of you who aren't familiar with Jobs for the Future, we are a national nonprofit organization. We work across kind of the education and workforce development systems to support equitable economic advancement for all Americans. Next slide. And within the context of that work that JFF does, I lead our national education to career pathways work. where we really are working with stakeholders from across K-12, higher education, workforce development, economic development, intermediary organizations, state and local government, to bring everyone together to do this work of building pathways that include work-based learning as a core component. And next slide. We focus in our pathways work on these kind of 5 key levers for implementation that include aligning and integrating secondary and post-secondary education, providing career navigation supports and building systems to support that for young people, work-based learning, about which I will say much more, and intermediaries, about which I will also say a bit more, and then also really think of leadership and policy as foundational to all of this work. Next slide. So of those 5 levers, I probably shouldn't have a favorite. It's sort of like having a favorite child, but I do. Mine is work-based learning. And, and it's because I think work-based learning is so critical to everything that we are trying to accomplish as we think about how to support young people in really, having an opportunity for choice and building the kinds of futures that they envision for themselves, while also attaining some economic security. So all of that said, here is how JFF defines high quality work-based learning. And that is as activities in which a student goes into a workplace or works really directly with an industry professional. We know that that makes our definition of work-based learning a little bit different from some others. And there's a reason for that that I will get more into, but wanted to flag it here rather. And then the other piece is really performing meaningful job tasks that are developing skills and knowledge and readiness for work and can really be used to support career entry or advancement. We know that one of the problems work-based learning solves is that it's really hard to get a job if you haven't had a job. Next slide, please. And so as we think about that broad definition, there are a lot of different types of work-based learning that fall under that. And it really is important to start to sort through how we're thinking about some of that. So many of you have probably seen versions of a work-based learning continuum before that sort of bucket things out, right? So on the sort of more intensive end, you'll have things like apprenticeship, and then internships are a little less intensive and job shadows a little less intensive still. And we have things bucketed similarly here, with a sort of note that we have, we also think about in conjunction with work-based learning, this career exploration piece that you see represented over on the left side of the slide, that is really about thinking about how we support career navigation, that is really important work, but not quite the same thing as work-based learning as we're thinking about our definition of it. And so, but the other piece of this, right, is that this is a bunch of boxes with little arrows going every which way, rather than a sort of tidy continuum from least intensive to most intensive. And the reason for that is that it's really important for work-based learning to be really intentionally designed and sequenced. So part of what that means is that work-based learning is not a checklist. I think we often see, especially in high schools, right? There's sort of like in 11th grade, you'll do a job shadow, and in 12th grade, you'll do an internship and sort of check and check. And the challenge with that is that what if you do a job shadow and you don't like it? Maybe the thing to do is not to go on to do an internship in sort of a similar field, but instead to do another job shadow, right, in another industry, so that we're really providing young people with opportunities to explore the world of work and learn in an iterative way. So what this is intended to represent is exactly this idea of one doesn't necessarily move in a linear way through all of these different types of work-based learning, but should instead, right, be participating in a really thoughtfully designed sequence of experiences. Next slide, please. And part of the reason for that is that each of these different types of experiences has different purposes, right? From kind of on the career exploration and just sort of starting to understand what might I be interested in. And then on sort of the career experience end of things where it's much more intensive, it really starts to be about gaining specific skills needed to work in an industry, permanent employment sometimes. So if you think about apprenticeships, for example, an apprenticeship is a form of work-based learning that typically involves related technical instruction, which is typically classroom-based. And apprentices are actual employees of the employer who's engaged there. So again, it's kind of a big spectrum as we think about the different purposes for all of this. And on the next slide, please, you see we sort of map these different models of work-based learning to those different purposes. Next slide, please. And as we're thinking about all of this, it's really critical to think about sort of a set of principles that are important for making sure that work-based learning is really high quality and effective. So those include, right, maybe the most obvious of the principles is really supporting entry and advancement, along career pathways. Um, Offering compensation is also a really critical piece of this. And again, this comes back to we need to distinguish among the different models. It is probably not appropriate to be offering, participants in a job shadow any kind of compensation. But for an internship or an apprenticeship, it really is critical. It's part of the definition of apprenticeship. We know not all internships offer compensation, and we know that is a big equity issue, because if we're not offering compensation for some of these more intensive models, we are effectively cutting out folks who may need to have paid employment that cuts into their time and ability to do things like participate in work-based learning. Work-based learning should reward skill development. So as folks develop skills through work-based learning, they should also be sort of rewarded, not necessarily financially, but with increased responsibility. And sort of, if you look on the right, the corollary to that is being really intentional about identifying skills to be developed and how they'll be validated. And part of the way we do that is through providing meaningful job tasks that are intentionally building skills and knowledge, while at the same time thinking about how all of this ties back to classroom learning or academic learning. So work-based learning is not necessarily, something that should be happening in isolation, but should be tied into a larger kind of learning experience. And we know that comprehensive student supports are really critical to make sure that all learners can participate. Next slide, please. And the reason for this is that it's all about equity. We know actually that lots of folks have access to work-based learning. They typically already have bachelor's degrees and are employed. And so that is not necessarily getting us to where we're hoping to go as we think about an equitable strategy for economic advancement for all Americans. Next slide, please. And part of the reason for that is if we think about sort of the education side and think about sort of degrees and credentials, if you look at the data, what you see is that degrees don't actually produce the same outcomes for everyone. And so what this is showing, this graph, and I won't talk through the whole thing, but that is, right, college graduates who are not from low-income families have much higher earnings than everyone else. So just getting the degree is clearly not enough for everyone. Next slide, please. And part of this is we know majors matter quite a lot in terms of sort of career advancement and career prospects. And I'm not, and what I want to really flag here is that this data is from a poll of recent college graduates who were asked, where did you get the most helpful advice about what to major in college? And so the little sort of green bars are showing where people got their advice, in informal work-based settings, informal school-based, more formal school-based, and through their informal social networks. And the blue bars are showing how helpful people found those different sources of advice to be. And what you can see here is that informal work-based advice was the least frequently accessed and the most helpful. And this really brings us directly to the issue of building a professional network, professional social capital, which are critical functions of work-based learning and have a big effect on people's career prospects, arguably much more than a degree. And so, right, again, as we're thinking about equity in all of this, really, and comes back to why we define work-based learning as being in a workplace or working directly with an employer. It's because, right, those are critical parts of building those professional networks and professional social capital. Next slide, please. And we know that work-based learning has a ton of value for employers too. We hear a lot, it's hard to get employers to engage and it's hard to scale work-based learning, and those things are true. And I think that they are worth it for a lot of the reasons that I was just saying. But we also know that employers who are actually engaged say that this has a lot of value for them. Next slide, please. And we know that part of what is helpful in getting employers to sort of understand the value and really to make work-based learning a workable system for everyone. We know that this is challenging to scale. Carrie and Maude will say much more in a minute about how they are doing it in their contexts. But spoiler alert, both Texas and Washington are investing in intermediaries as part of this. And intermediaries are organizations that are able to work across educators and employers who, as you may all know, often speak very different languages, have very different timelines on which they're expecting things to happen. And so intermediaries play a big role in sort of doing some of this translation in terms of really kind of brokering work-based learning experiences that are supporting young people. And at the same time, supporting educators and employers, none of whom are necessarily set up to do this on their own. And just wanted to say one thing, and there have been QR codes throughout, as you've seen, and the slides are online, but JFF has built out this work-based learning system navigator tool where you can take a little quiz about sort of who's in your work-based learning ecosystem and start to think about who else you might want to pull in and what role an intermediary could play in all of that. And with all of that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie Ballast, who can talk much more about sort of the practicalities of what all of this looks like in implementation.
Thank you, Charlotte. Just a little delay on the camera there. It does get tense sometimes, doesn't it? So happy to be talking with all of you. I'm gonna tell you about the experience that we had here in Texas about building what we refer to as our work-based learning strategic framework. We were charged with doing this through legislation, and the legislation was directed at what we refer to as the Tri-Agency Workforce Initiative. In Texas, our governor formed a partnership across K-12, post-secondary education, and workforce, and our instructions are to work together and to bring together the work that we do in a comprehensive way that we're all thinking about where individuals are, in whether they're in K-12, whether they're in workforce, whether they're in post-secondary education, and to just, as you probably many of you know, sometimes when you look at the three separate agencies, there are competing priorities, there's competing language, competing approaches, and this has really stretched us in learning how to work together. So as part of this initiative, and if you'll go to the next slide, we were directed through legislation to develop a strategic framework for our state. And what I want to do for you today is I want to give you some very easy, quick and easy wins and just some things that we learned about ourselves as we did this work. Number one, what we learned is that when three agencies come together and each of us has a different lens of thinking about work-based learning, one of the first things that we saw was that we needed to recognize what happens at each phase of an individual's lifetime. It's safe to say that most experience K-12. It's safe to say almost all experience workforce, and it's safe to say that some experience post-secondary or in the traditional forms that we know it. And as we came together on this work, what we realized is that we were bringing different lenses and different experiences and different thoughts about what truly work-based learning looks like. So what we learned from our K-12 partners is that so much goes on in those early grades and throughout middle school and high school that truly don't fit into the work-based learning model, but should be recognized for what they are. And this would be career fairs and job shadowing and virtual experiences. And just this idea of we begin to introduce this concept of career and work at early ages. And we didn't want to completely dismiss that. We did want to point out that important things happen as we begin to think about our careers and where we're headed. And so the first thing that we did before we tackled this concept of work-based learning is we wanted to acknowledge that there is a part of this in which we go through career development. And this is where we identify what we're interested in. This is where we begin to think about the careers that we might be working towards, and just learning by observing and talking and being exposed to these things. And so we started there, and this was a good learning point for us. So rule number one we learned is that not everything is work-based learning, but it should be given the recognition that it is an important part. There are steps in this that are important to identify. The other thing we learned about ourselves is that because of the experiences we brought to it, we all had a very different idea about work-based learning and what happens at each stage. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we got to our final continuum. So if you'll go ahead. And this is where, once we got the acknowledgement of what happens as we become aware of careers and start to make decisions based on our interest, we developed our continuum. So the next slide. Number one, the legislation tasked us with creating a definition. And again, I'm going to go back to those of you who have worked across many agencies, and surely you know the feat of agreeing on a definition that we can all work with was a big step for all of this. So number one, we did develop a definition, and that's at the top of this slide. And then we began to talk about, so what are, when we go through work-based learning experiences, what are they? And so we identified the 3 points of the continuum that you see on the screen. We learn about work, we learn through work, and we learn at work. And we were very purposeful to show that there's no one start and stopping point to this. It's an ongoing cycle, and that at any point in our lives, we might find ourselves back at the learning about work stage. And it was essential to us that, number one, as a group, we recognize that too. So here's the second learning point we had. We came to this with different experiences, and I got to be honest with you, depending on how you get to where you are in this work, your experiences are very different, and sometimes they don't have the full view of all the many, many people we're thinking about and working for. So for example, someone who has followed a traditional pathway, someone who was successful in K-12, that led to success at a university, that led to success in a career. At some point in the conversations, we talk to ourselves and we realize that this is not the experience of everyone. Some aren't successful in K-12. And then they, for instance, might get to a certain point in K-12 and then are in the workforce, or they might be at a certain point in post-secondary and are having to go back into the workforce. And so it was crucial that, number one, we identified that whether you're an adult, a child, a college-age student, you could be on this continuum at any point. It was an important lesson for us to learn too. And then we also wanted to recognize that at any point in anyone's career or pathway, you might find yourself starting over again, or choosing to back up and take another approach, or rethinking a career, or rethinking education and wanting to go back. And that is why we pointed out that there's never any one start or stopping point for this. And then finally, the third takeaway. So number one, important things happen before work-based learning. Number two, our experiences are very different, and we need to recognize that, and recognize that at any age, we could be jumping in at a new point, or starting over, or pushing ourselves further. And then number three, we needed a common vocabulary, because we also learned that depending on what we were thinking about and our own experiences, we were using different words. And that's what Texas was hungry for. Please use the same words. Please use the same approaches, and please just put us all on a common field, that when we talk about work-based learning and when we think about what's successful and how we should promote this and build it, that we're all using the same language and talk to each other more clearly. And so for our last slide, this link will take you to the report that we produced, and it gives some information, number one, about the continuum that we developed. It also contains the common vocabulary that we developed. And as Charlotte referenced a moment ago, we included some quality indicators of high quality work-based learning, but this was really the culmination of our first effort as working together across the three agencies. So probably a greater learning experience for us than we ever imagined, but glad we got that work done. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Maud.
Thanks so much to both Carrie and Charlotte. This has been fun to listen to both of you, because Career Connect Washington is nested right in the middle of all of these pieces that you've described. Career Connect is a statewide system for career-connected learning. And if we go forward a slide, it has a vision. It was created in 2018 after a huge listening tour across the entire state. Thousands of people participated, employers, students, educators, and community-based people, to define exactly what Carrie said, a common definition of where are we trying to go? What are we trying to accomplish here? And this was it, that we want every young adult in Washington to have many pathways towards economic self-sufficiency and fulfillment, and that is going to be strengthened by this comprehensive statewide system for career-connected learning. And the implication here is it's all embedded right into our education system. It's not, you have to leave education to do this. It is a part of your educational journey. A huge focus on equity is part of this, because we acknowledge that the system from which these students were emerging or connecting with us or with the community-based organizations and employers had a history, if you look at the data, of not serving Black, Brown, Indigenous students very well. So we really knew we had to intentionally focus on those populations to create equity in the system. We aspire to offer this to each and every student in the state of Washington, but we put extra emphasis on folks that are furthest from opportunity historically and who have not necessarily had a great experience in the education system. If we go forward a slide. We did arrive at a common definition of what we mean by career-connected learning by asking the question of many, many people, thousands of people, what does it mean to you? And we bucketed it. And this looks very familiar based on what you just heard from the other two panelists, that explore is that early exposure, what is around me, what could I possibly do with myself? It starts in elementary and middle school. A lot of this is already happening in our state, and a lot of our intention was never to duplicate, but just to support the increased attention to it and provide resources to get employers more connected directly into each of these levels. Prep is actually a deeper dive into a specific job area. So maybe healthcare, maybe it's IT, and it's a deeper exposure. It's not necessarily skill building. It connects very nicely to high school level career and technical education, and skill center works for those of you who are familiar with that terminology. I don't know how it works in each of your states, but those kinds of experiences that happen in the high school level. So this is high school level preparation. And then finally, launch, which I want to dwell on just a little bit. If you go to the next slide. Launch is the highest level of the continuum. It's the most rigorous, and it is aligned again with Charlotte's presentation in particular. It involves meaningful, high quality on-the-job experience. It aligns to classroom learning. So in other words, it's theory and practice together to produce a competitive candidate and a valuable credential beyond the high school diploma. It's paid. Very important to stress, it's paid. And it's also very important to stress that this whole idea stems from a competency-based idea, which is, if you go down the little checklist below, meaningful, high quality on the job experience, you'll notice we have to define the competencies and skills of that job at the beginning, we, the program builder, in order to actually create the curriculum. So it starts with, what are those key competencies and skills we're trying to essentially impart to that participant so that they are qualified to be a real candidate for this job. So the entire approach of Career Launch is a competency-based approach. And essentially what is being evaluated through the experience is whether they are fully prepared and have those competencies and skills to attain the job. Importantly, too, the notion of doing this stems not just from job, which is really critical. Let's face it, every student that goes through and pays what you have to pay for post-secondary education today in our country has in mind that they're going to have some gainful employment. They're going to be able to afford to have that educational investment. But in our approach, we're actually really interested in advancing learning at the same time. So in other words, we want to get students past their secondary experience into a post-secondary experience, because we know that they're going to be able to have greater earnings power. And we also know it's super good for the Washington economy. My colleague who's here today, Ingrid Stegemuller, is going to join me for the Q&A. She is a full-time leader for Career Connect Washington that resides at the Washington Roundtable. And the Washington Roundtable has been a key partner in this work from the get-go, because they believe that we have to get 70% of our kids past secondary education to attain that credential or degree to be able to sustain and support this economy. So the Roundtable's role is really to help engage employers and activate employers to participate in these experiences, which we think really do lead to mastery-based education, competency-based education that really fuels not only agency in the individuals, but also helps fuel our economy. And those individuals then have earnings power they never would have had before. So all of these experiences in Career Launch have to have at least 1 year of post-secondary education attached to them to make that bridge to get students past high school to get that credential or degree. And obviously, they have to either offer a credential or that significant progress. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, we also, in part of Career Connect, beyond establishing that common definition, common framework, and providing a lot of funding, by the way, we were fortunate to have the legislature in 2019 authorize not only the framework, but also significant amounts of funding, and establish this coalition of partners. Who are these people? Why do we need them? You'll see on the outside, these are all the key partners: higher ed, K-12, employers, labor, government. We all work with them, and we all know how important they are. And we all know that they don't always talk to each other. And so what we found when we did our listening tour in 2018 was, hey, educators have a really hard time figuring out how to connect with employers and vice versa. And so we put in place for the state, all of these folks are selected through competitive procurement. They're in contracts. They're not permanent FTE, and that is really to create a very performance-driven system. We have 9 regional network leaders. They reside in all parts. It covers the entire state of Washington. We have now granted over 100 program builders funds to build specific programs that they aspire to do, that they see a need for between employers and educators, and be that bridge, be that facilitator, help make the connection. We have sector intermediaries that are statewide industry leaders who look across the entire system and say, wow, we have gaps. In Spokane, they don't have advanced manufacturing programs. Let's move this cool program from Vancouver over to Seattle, et cetera. So the sector intermediaries are helping to map out where we need to go and provide input to our procurement people about where grants should be offered in the next round. And then we have career connected learning coordinators that are residing in each of the education service districts in our state, which are kind of those aggregate, they provide services to many K-12 institutions, and they do the outreach to the K-12 system just to try to get this embedded there, because we want to capture those students as they're still in their secondary life. So to conclude, I mean, if you go to the next slide, this approach of having a framework, a funding mechanism, one more slide, I can't see it yet. Advance the slide maybe. Anyway, I was going to show you the results of our, whoops, the results of our efforts. But just to just do a voiceover on it, we now have 16,000 students participating, or young people participating at the career launch level, which is very exciting. When we started this effort, we only had registered apprenticeship in our state, and registered apprenticeship is absolutely fantastic. Here it is. And we have helped grow the registered apprenticeship system. If you look, 183 new career launch programs have been created since really about the beginning of 2020. And this data is 6 months old. So over a very short period of time, across the whole state in all industry sectors, IT, healthcare, advanced manufacturing, and so on, 70 of these are in the registered apprenticeship system. So we've diversified registered apprenticeship from being building trades only, which I'm sure many of you have seen, to a much more diversified set of approaches. And in parallel, we have 110 new programs that are education employer connected programs that labor sits on a committee that helps endorse them. So we have a high quality bar for that, and labor buys into what we're doing to make sure that we're not denigrating in any way what that experience looks like. It has to be a super high quality experience to give students exactly what they need. It cannot be leading to a dead end, for example. It has to be connected to many employers who have real opportunity. And lastly, I would say we've been fortunate to get a couple of large federal grant awards in the last year or two that are helping us to build the system out faster. We aspire to have something, equivalent to 7 to 8 to 9 new entry-level programs in each part of our state and relevant sectors of the economy to their area. And we're making great progress. It's been kind of amazing. So with that, I look forward to your Q&A, and Ingrid from the roundtable will help me answer questions when we get there. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Maude, and Carrie and Charlotte. Your comments lead perfectly into our state and federal policy recommendations that we'll get to as well. And Maude, as always, with all of us working through Zoom, these things kind of happen. So thanks for navigating that little glitch. Appreciate you. We do have folks that are joining us that are state policy leaders and federal policy leaders, and you all play an important role in shaping these work-based learning experiences, even though the nexus of the work is done typically within state and local contexts and depend on the economic opportunities and needs of different geographic regions. States and regions use a variety of federal resources to create these opportunities, using federal policy to provide guidance and incentives to leverage resources effectively and equitably, as we've heard just now. So in this initial square you see on the left side of the screen, you'll see federal recommendations to advance work-based learning, specifically tied to funding recommendations, such as launching a major federal cross-agency program to stimulate significant investments in modernizing work-based learning. Exactly what we just heard. So new grant programs focusing on innovating state and regional work-based learning and competency-based pathway programs, including paid work placements. We heard the importance of the paid aspect of those placements that span pre-K through 12, CTE, post-secondary ed, and of course, industry and workforce. And as a part of that is also making sure we pay special attention to systems that include competency-based credentials, micro-credentials that recognize and validate learning anywhere, anytime, and the need to bridge these systems with institutions of higher ed, really creating credentials of value. We can also increase federal resources through innovation grants to states and intermediate organizations. Again, we've heard a lot of that today, to align and coordinate transformation efforts across education and employment pathways in states. So some priorities around that could include expanding equitable access to work-based learning by race, identity, disability, or opportunity, such as students who might be disengaged or behind in attaining credentials of value. Support states could also look at supporting states moving to competency-based systems for education, as Lori shared earlier in the policy map. That's every state in terms of workforce training and credentialing. And we could also prioritize the incentivizing, creating competency frameworks and the infrastructure needed to support those competency-based pathways for building knowledge and skills. And also incentivize mapping systems in alignment across early learning, PK-12 education, CTE, post-secondary ed, and certainly workforce to support competency-based pathways. I feel like I'm just building upon the great recommendation shared earlier. And also ensuring those intermediary orgs are eligible for federal grant funds and state funds to support work-based learning and pathways to coordinate partnerships across the state, region, and local entities. And we should also, as we've heard a lot today, is like allow for that flexible blending and braiding of federal funds into state, regional, or local innovation, revolving funds, and providing more flexible reporting for blended resources. Consider simplifying, combining, and or allowing recipients to combine existing funding resources to reduce silos and focus federal funds to increase their impact. And to support the enabling conditions, which is the section on the right there, we should consider supporting development and implementations of high quality professional learning for educators and work-based learning providers. That's a big shift, right? Like it's not something that we typically learn in our professional certification programs. Increasing funding for statewide longitudinal data systems, grant programs, and data systems interoperability across different aspects of education systems, including early childhood, PK-12, and post-secondary ed, and certainly across other education and employment systems, which a piece we can get to later, and we can do a whole webinar on how those systems come together. But data systems that support pathway and learner education and employment records, these offer technical assistance for improving and moving to competency-based credentials, and also modernize data infrastructure needed to transform educational systems, like different ways to measure what we value. And removing the ban on student outcomes data collection in the Higher Education Act could help to create a secure, privacy-protected student-level data network at the National Center for Ed Statistics. And of course, providing tax incentives to employers supporting work-based learning would be super valuable. Could advance the next slide, please. In terms of state policy recommendations at the state level, there's an opportunity for the federal government to incentivize state modernization and coordination of work-based learning programs, including the rethinking of governance and bringing together government, education, and business leaders to help create coherent systems locally, regionally, and statewide for education training, just as we heard in Texas and in Washington. These career-aligned pathways recognize learning that happens inside and outside of schools, in the workforce, and in communities, which absolutely ties into competence-based education. And then some state recommendations to advance work-based learning, capacity building and coherence, like build intermediary capacity to spur innovations in work-based learning and help address insurance needs for employers supporting work-based learning, internship and apprenticeship programs. Like these are real items, issues that employers are wrestling with as they want to create these opportunities for young people. Fund grants to expand pathways and paid work-based learning opportunities, as we've heard a lot today, and create revolving innovation funds to support blending and braiding of federal and state resources to support paid work-based learning and simplify reporting on blending funds. As we saw before, whether it's through Department of Labor, Department of Commerce, Department of Health and Human Services, like there's a variety of ways to really think differently about how we resource these learning experiences. Supporting digital learning employment records, infrastructure, and digital wallets that learners own for a lifetime of building knowledge and skills. Imagine what that could look like across the state and region as well. And so we have been throwing a lot of ideas at you in respect to what this could look like, what it actually looks like in some regions of the country. We invite you, as you have been doing in chat, to ask some questions and to provide some insights of your own from wherever you might be joining us across the globe as well. And I'm going to go back to a question that was asked earlier and ask it to the panel and put it back to you all. The question centered around the difference between work-based learning and work. Oh, geez, what was the term? Team, help me out. Work-based learning, work integrated learning. I think we tried to answer, but it was an educated guess. Who can answer the difference between the two?
Go ahead, Maud. You look like you're.
I was just hoping you were going to answer that question. My quick answer would be I don't see a huge difference between them. I think they're used, at least in our state, very interchangeably. Basically, I guess the work integrated maybe has a bigger implication of a classroom component to the experience. Like it's not just learning on the job, it's actually integrated with what you're learning in the classroom at the same time. So I guess I'd make that sort of distinction, but I think in many cases that's really not it's not a firm line. But Charlotte, you help me.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think work integrated learning is not a phrase that's used much in the US, so it's a little like all the same. And my understanding is that work integrated learning is definitionally connected to sort of classroom and academic learning, whereas work-based learning is connected to academic learning when it is being done well, but it is actually not technically part of the definition.
Appreciate it. Thank you for that. I think for Carrie and Maud, I think there was a question. Thank you, Lori, for capturing all the questions shared earlier in the chat. Like, what are the learner metrics that you're using to evaluate success? Carrie or Maud, either one. Go for it.
I'll take a shot at that first. Part of our work is that we also had to think about how do you measure success on this? So number one, what we want to we have the unique ability to, through being the state agency that also collects our wage data, we begin to see the longitudinal data of someone who has been through an experience, and whether it led to the job or career that that the early work did. And if not, sometimes there's that, as we all know, our own pathways have taken us to places we never expected. But we do get to see through wage data if someone's employed in the industry in which they receive some of these experiences. We also get to see the longevity of them being in those industries, and to see wage data, to see if it's providing a self-sufficient wage, and if it's of benefit to both the employer and the employee who's gone through an experience like this.
And for us in the state of Washington, similarly, we have metrics associated with that we measure ourselves against every year. It has to do with how much the percentage of students participating in each level of the continuum I shared. We do aspire to have 100% of young people participate in Explore and Prep during the time they're in K-12. We are working with the state's K-12 system to try to figure out how we actually capture whether that's happening. Their intention is there, but whether or not it's actually happening, we have an instrument called the High School and Beyond Plan that is now being systematized and put into a digital form across the whole state that we think will be key to actually capturing this. And the point of the first two steps is just, did you get something out of it as a kid? There's no grade associated with it or anything. It's really, what did you learn and what did it make you think about in terms of your own journey forward? On launch, it's a different regimen in a way, because it is trying to attain that credential or at least a year's worth of college experience or post-secondary experience. So when we set up launch programs, we know what it takes to complete that program, and we measure enrollments, completion, and then we measure the next step. Like, did they end up in gainful employment of some kind that's connected, or is it kind of something completely different? And or did they return back to their educational journey? Either of which we see as success. We do not, as I said earlier, think 100% of people need to necessarily land in a job, because this is not intended to be a workforce total program. It can be, but basically we're trying to get people to experiment enough that they know what they want to do and land in something that they care about. So it's a long answer, sorry about that, but we have a very great state data system. It is a data warehouse that integrates all our education data with our employment data, with our job outcome data. And so we can work with the state warehouse that manages that to get this data and pull it. And it's a little bit lagging all the time, about 6 months late, but it's excellent.
Thank you, team, for that. And you might hear my dog getting really excited about all of these innovative work that's happening. So I apologize for the background noise. And before we do conclude, there he is. He's so excited about the work. We'll have a short survey on the webinar, but as we ask one final question, but as we're answering this final question, can we include the survey link, team, on here so we make sure we capture that before folks start to depart? It's on its way.
Yes, and it should pop up when when the webinar ends. So
oh, perfect. Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
There is a link to it, I think.
I appreciate it, Laurie. How do you prepare? What's the training look like necessary for professionals that are included in this work to be able to lead this work? And if I'm wearing my teacher and principal hat again, how do we prepare folks to prepare young people to participate in these learning experiences? And I'll just conclude on that.
This is a great question, and I know we're at time. I think that this is like building capacity throughout the system. So for educators and for all stakeholders is really essential, as we heard everyone talking about as a through line. And I think getting creative, thinking about differentiated roles where teachers may be teaching in a classroom as we kind of think of school, but also are having other roles and are starting to facilitate projects and job shadowing, right, for their students that actually tie the curriculum and their academic disciplines to real world applications in the workplace. So I think thinking creatively about how to structure time and then provide opportunities for experimentation, right, for communities of practice for educators are all part of steps to take. And this is really shows like this is longer term systems change, right? So there, there's work to do to align lots of levels of the system, both for practice and policy.
Thank you, Lori. Want to thank you, Maud, Carrie, and Charlotte for sharing your wisdom at this webinar, and also invite all of you to join us in these types of conversations at our symposium, November 3rd through the 5th in New Orleans. Thank you all. Appreciate you. We will share resources and the recording in the near future. Take care.